thank you, Stan. And as Stan mentioned, we're going to be doing part one and a part two. So the part one is the easy part, and that's my part. And as Stan mentioned, Dr. Campbell's voice is a little shaky today, so I may end up doing the bulk of part two with a commentary from Dr. Campbell. And that kind of reminds me of a story, and I hesitate to tell a story because I usually get stories wrong, or I take too long telling the story. But and I refer to Dr. Campbell and Dr. Hughes and Dr. Bateson and Dr. Morgan and Dr. Fear back there as chauffeurs. And do you know what I'm talking about when I say they're chauffeurs? Has anyone heard the story, and I'm sure you all have at some point, of Einstein when he was early in his career, and he used to go around and do lectures around the country, and this was before people knew who he was, and so his name wasn't out there in the press, and the other thing about Einstein was that he didn't drive, and so his chauffeur would take him around to all these lectures around the country, and he would do all these early lectures, and the driver would go to these lectures with him and would sit in the back of the room at every one of these lectures, and it got to the point where it was pretty monotonous. He would hear this lecture over and over as Einstein went around the country giving the same lecture, and as you know, Einstein was brilliant, and so there weren't too many questions usually when Einstein finished speaking. So at some point, just to relieve the monotony, the driver and the chauffeur said, I've heard you give this thing over 50 times now, and I'll bet you I could give this lecture. And I'd say, oh, you think you can give my lecture, huh? And he said, yeah, I think I could. I've heard you give this all over the country, so I think I can do it. He said, okay, let's try this out. So on this next one, why don't you go ahead and give my lecture? He said, I'd be glad to. I can give this thing in my sleep now. I've heard you give this so many times. So they went to the next spot that they had to give the lecture, and the driver went up and said, hello, my name's Albert Einstein. And Einstein sat in the back of the room watching, and he proceeded to give just a perfect lecture, just like he was Einstein. Gave the perfect lecture, got done, and thought he's really good of himself, and he was going to go back and show Einstein, see, anybody can give this lecture. And all of a sudden, a hand went up. And he said, oh, we have a question. and this pompous professor stood up and gave a 15-minute question about the formation of mass theory, and went and proceeded to throw in all kinds of other theories, and then posed the question to the chauffeur, who was standing up there just thinking, oh boy, what am I going to do now? Because I'll give it away. I'm not, they're going to find out I'm not Einstein. So he let the professor talk, and he said, what am I going to do here? And so finally the professor got done asking his question, and he didn't want to give himself away, so he said, that's about the simplest question I've ever heard. In fact, that question is so simple, I'm going to ask my chauffeur in the back of the room to answer that question. So Einstein answered the question. So I feel pretty much in that same boat. So if I will often refer to the doctors I just mentioned here to help answer some of these questions, because they really have been instrumental in putting a lot of this together. So let's look at the first part of this, and as we've heard already, it really has been an effort of a lot of folks in the Partnership for Food Protection. Has really been that thing that has kind of focused us and given us the vision and the goal. But it's been really a joint effort really over 5 years ago, because IFPTI and FDA had a cooperative agreement before our current 5-year agreement. And that's where it was on the heels of this Partnership for Food Protection effort. So if you remember back then, in fact, how many of you were at the 1998 50 state meeting? Is there anyone still in the room here? Interesting. There's no one. Huh. Well, I remember sending some of my people to that 1998 meeting, and a lot of good things came out of that. As you recall, there's a lot of things that came out of that, ElexNet and some of the other efforts. And then 10 years went by, and then FDA said, hey, let's get another 50-state meeting together because times have changed. There was a lot going on. And really notably, if you remember, over that period of time were all the things that was a prelude to Food Safety Modernization Act. So all the outbreaks that were happening and things that we were all scratching our heads about. So in 2008, which I was at, and how many of us here were at the 2008 50-state meeting? A lot more hands have gone up. Yes. And so at that, as you know, well, first of all, back in 98, apparently training came up as an issue, and it really never kind of caught on as an initiative or something that there was some gelling around. And so it kind of just sat on the shelf for about 10 years. And then but by the time the 2008 50-state meeting came around, there was a lot of interest in training, because that's when we started talking about the integrated food safety system and the importance of training and regulatory staff to meet that vision for an integrated food safety system. So that's training in earnest was a topic at the 2008 meeting, and that, as you know, a separate work group was formed with PFP in order to address that. And that's when we first started talking about how do we come about and approach training from a national perspective. So then, one of the things that came out of those discussions in 2009 was you see it's in quotes here, the Gary Gurman bubble chart. How many have heard or seen the Gary Gurman bubble chart? Okay, a lot of hands. All right. Well, get ready for a blast from the past. And here it is. There it is. So if you've not seen this was really, I think this was on all the lecture circuits back then, and DHRD. I think a lot of folks from DHRD were the ones that were going around and showing this, and as it related to the integrated food safety system. So that's one thing I want to point out. I'm not going to go through all this, but really this was the vision for starting to approach a national common training system. And so at the top, draft integrated, so there's that word integrated food safety training and certification system. So that was on the heels of the integrated food safety system in general. So what did that mean by integrated? So you'll see that DHRD at the time said, well, to be integrated, we have to include all stakeholders. And so all those bubbles that you see in all the different colors kind of represent all the people who have a stake in training and in an integration of the whole food safety system. So you'll see things like associations. So there are a lot of folks in the room here that represent associations. And even training providers or training companies, and at the time even it was thought of private training companies could be involved in this. Centers of excellence. So FDA said, well, maybe we need to create some centers of excellence. And it's a little dark on your screen, but you'll see the regulatory agencies themselves are obviously going to have to play a part in this. So this was the kind of the precursor to a lot of work that followed this. And as we all know, everything starts with a vision, everything starts with a model, and then the model improves. And so I think we really, the models that we're going to be talking about today, really come from this basic foundational model. And so we could go into a lot of other detail about this, but in fact, if you look down at the very, very bottom where it says training councils on the left-hand side, I think really what we're here, us here today, is kind of that vision fulfilled. It's let's have a council of people and let's meet and let's discuss training and let's kind of set the priorities for training and training policies. So this really has come a long way, and a lot of these things have come to fruition. So we'll have to put this with the bon vivant in the front cabinet. Back then also, right around that point in time, there was a lot of discussion with some of these chauffeurs that I've referred to in the room. And it was agreed that, we have to tackle and approach training in a new way. And it really has to mean something. And so at the time, we said, well, let's kind of split up the effort. Let's kind of come at it from two different ways, and let's kind of approach this call for a national curriculum and split up our resources. So at the time, DHRD agreed that they would take this job task analysis approach. And so, as you recall, a number of committees were formed, and they looked at current jobs and went through a systematic process of identifying the tasks and for those jobs. And along the way, you come out with identifying competencies, specific tasks, looking at defining the job and who does that job. So FDA did a number of job task analyses, and then NEHA has kind of picked up on that and have also used that process for other things and have taken that and moved it along faster as well. And of course, you can talk to Rance here about other uses for those JTAs. So not only to look at approaching training, but certification as well. And then at the time, the group said, well, okay, IFPTI, you come at it from the performance expectation or the outcomes-based approach. And then we're going to meet in the middle. We're going to both utilize and have these dovetail, and then that should help us kind of quickly, or quicker, I should say, maybe not quickly, but a faster approach the common goal, which is to get this common curriculum built. So that you'll hear a lot about today is the approaches that kind of merge these two, and when we look and talk more today about the competency-based approach. Validation is important, and I know that once you take the preventive controls training, you're going to hear a lot about the difference between validation and verification. And if you want to hear more about that, Kathy Gombitz is back there somewhere, and she could probably talk about that. But we need to make sure that things are valid. So people aren't just making this up. So there are some validation models that are used, and we've been using these validity models all along the way. So whether it's the, what does this say? I guess I don't know where there it is. So as you can see, the job task analysis approach, first of all, if you have anything you do with just one expert, that has a real high risk to it because it's just one expert saying here's the way it should be. So I think we all agree that that's a real high risk for getting it wrong. I mean, the expert may know a lot, but in terms of whether it really is applicable and produces some measurable effect, we need to make sure more people are involved. So that's where you see this high risk when you're using just smaller groups or just directives. But if we look at job task analysis, it is higher in resourcing and higher number of people involved, but it results in really a low risk in terms of whether you get it right or wrong. And so therefore that's how you measure your validity. And then you do that also with focus groups, validation by vote. So you see as we move to this end of the spectrum that we're making sure that what we're doing is valid. And so as you see, FDA's been working here in this area with job task analysis. IFPTI's been pretty much using this in this range, but we're all using focus groups and validation by vote. And so that's why a lot of you get emails asking to go take a half hour or 2 hours sometimes out of your day to go through some competencies and to help validate those. And I've been, quite frankly, surprised at the response. I think, and how many have seen a lot of these and participated in some of the validation? So a number of hands going up here in the room. But frankly, I'm surprised. We've sent a number of these out, and I know, Neha, you've sent out some validation of job task analyses. And the community and the support we've gotten from associations and the profession is overwhelming. I thought, who in the world would take 2 hours or more to sit and read competencies and to actually think about them and to actually do an assessment and respond back in a survey. And I cautioned folks, I said, gosh, we'll be lucky if we get 3 responses because people are so busy. But we consistently get overwhelming response, and it's amazing to see. I know in one instance, 70, 200 people, And so that really lends itself to validating these models. Okay, so then historic, again, there back in 2009, something just like this was held, and it was a stakeholder training advisory council meeting. And there's a lot of discussion around the room, and the discussion kind of centered around, we need this national curriculum. How do we approach that? How do we create a common open source curriculum for the community? And so there's a lot of discussion about that. And go back one. And so this, as you see, is a very early version of the framework that we see now. And that's what kind of came out of that advisory council. So in fact, there were some volunteers from that initial advisory council meeting that went to Cornell and had a meeting, a multi-day meeting at Cornell to kind of put this approach together. They talked a lot about putting competencies, a competency framework together that would then build on a curriculum framework. And that's where a lot of this initial work took place, was at that meeting at Cornell in 2009. And then out of that, a curriculum team was assembled. And that consisted of federal, state, local, and academic partners. And I know that some of the DHRD folks are here who were on that initial curriculum team. And I'm not sure, is anybody else here that was originally on that team? Yeah, okay. So that was another historic event that was kind of the precursor. And so they took the bubble chart and they sat in a room and they said, how can we use this to kind of come out and approach this? So on this slide, I could just read it, but I'm not going to. But what I do want to point out is these words. And so a vision. So the framework was thought that, people need to see something, so they, a symbol of a direction. So that's really what, at that point in time, it was thought that we would create this vision, but this would be the thing that people would look at and to remind them of this vision. A roadmap. So there was a lot of discussion about people need to understand the steps, and what, especially at the folks in the field, what steps do I need to take to be trained? And so the idea was that the framework could provide a roadmap for someone, or especially, as I'd like to say, for supervisors who have to make fiscal decisions about how to train people and where to spend my valuable training funds on my staff. Another word out here is integrated, and we've talked about that, the fact that we want to make sure that the framework, and at the time that the framework found a place for everyone to participate. Open source, and that's what, if you remember the bubble chart about how do we even have industry involved or private training companies involved. And so how do we approach it so that people, to avoid all the duplicative work, how do we find value in other things that are created by other people, and how would they participate in an open source curriculum? Career spanning, that was something that was decided was important, that it kind of helped someone throughout their career, span the course of their career. And we always said that just because you're 2 weeks away from retirement, you still should be learning. You should still be training. You should still be learning, and improving yourself. So training and learning doesn't stop just because you're close to retirement. And then some of these bullets here were discussed as well at the time. Open source cataloging system, and you heard Stan this morning use the analogy of a library, and we're going to use that analogy again, but I think we want to kind of look for something more robust. And so you'll see that we're going to talk a lot today about competencies, and really that becomes kind of the basis for everything, is the knowledge, skills, and abilities, attitudes, behaviors that we're really going to be able to measure, and therefore we want to kind of have everything focused toward this being able to measure it by using competencies as that common denominator throughout the whole system. The placement of learning events. We're going to hear about that today, and that's going to become very important because no matter who creates training, we're going to want to place it within the curriculum. We're going to align it, we're going to review it, we're going to place it in the curriculum so people know it, that if they take someone's course, that it counts for something, and here's what it counts for. And then a supervisor or a program manager can make a decision and say, well, gosh, I don't want to use that course for my staff because that's what, I'm not trying to do that with my staff. That's for maybe something down the road.